"Get off the porch. This is not your property," she screeched, pointing a trembling finger at me like she was about to cast a suburban hex. The only problem? I was sitting on my own front steps, sipping a hot cup of coffee, wearing a USMC hoodie, and wondering why this stranger thought she had the authority to evict me from my own home. I hadn't even swallowed my first sip when chaos kicked in. It was just another quiet Saturday morning in rural Georgia. The sun had barely crested over the pine trees, and the dew still clung to the grass like nature's morning yawn. I had my coffee, my dog Rusty curled up at my feet, and the peaceful hum of spring around me. Then she came stomping down the sidewalk like a pink-clad hurricane, blazer, clipboard, massive sunglasses, and that all-too-familiar haircut, the kind of woman whose voice travels faster than her logic. I didn't recognize her at first, but that didn't stop her from marching right up my driveway as if she owned it. "Excuse me, sir, you can't just sit here like this," she said, huffing as though the sight of a man on his own property was somehow offensive. I blinked slowly, trying to process the absurdity before responding. "Morning to you too. And I can't sit where exactly?" I gestured around. "On your porch. This is a common-use community entry point," she snapped. "You're in violation of HOA Ordinance 12B. No loitering in shared zones." That was when I knew she was either completely delusional or had just graduated from the University of Make It Up as you go. I tried not to laugh. "Ma'am," I said gently, "I built this porch with my own 2 hands. The lumber store still sends me holiday coupons. This is my house. There's no HOA here." She clicked her pen like it was a loaded weapon and brandished a sheet of paper toward me. It looked like something printed from a middle schooler's PowerPoint. Comic Sans font, clip heart of a judge's gavel, and some random lines about community enhancement restrictions that had zero legal backing. "I am the interim president of the transition board," she said with pride, "and we are initiating compliance protocols." That sentence alone could have fueled an entire stand-up special. I took the paper, glanced at it, and handed it back. "There's no HOA, and even if there was, this isn't how it works. You don't just create one and start handing out fake fines." She stepped closer, voice rising. "You are non-compliant. I am issuing a verbal notice of removal. Please vacate the porch immediately." Rusty, my old golden retriever, perked up his ears and gave a low growl. Even he sensed we were dealing with a special brand of crazy. I patted him on the head and stood up slowly, not because I was intimidated, because I knew I needed to stay calm. Last thing I wanted was this woman trying to spin some tale to the police. "That's not going to happen," I said firmly. "You're trespassing, and if you don't step off my property in the next 10 seconds, I'll be calling the sheriff myself." She smirked. "Good. Call them. In fact, I'll do you one better." She whipped out her phone and put it on speaker. The man who answered sounded like he was elbow deep in a bucket of motor oil. "Greg," she barked, "this is an emergency. That male is refusing to leave the entry porch. I need HOA enforcement at lot 17. Now." I don't know what HOA enforcers look like in her fantasy world, but Greg sounded more like the kind of guy who sells radiator caps out of a van behind an auto shop. I raised my eyebrows. "On my way," he said gruffly. "Tell him we don't mess around." Karen, because of course that was her name, turned to me triumphantly. "See? Certified compliance officer is en route. You're in big trouble." That was it. I'd had my fill of this poorly scripted community theater. I calmly pulled out my phone and texted a single sentence into my Marine Corps unit group chat. "Some nut is trying to evict me from my porch. Feel like dropping by." Within 30 seconds, the chat lit up. My phone buzzed nonstop. Messages like, "Be there in 20, and want me in uniform or casual, and bring the flags," flooded in. These weren't just old war buddies. They were federal agents, deputies, military lawyers, firefighters, brothers I'd bled with, and some who owed me a beer or 3. While Karen was busy taking pictures of my house and mumbling about non-regulation colors on flower pots, I leaned back on the porch, took another sip of coffee, and grinned. She had no idea what she had just stepped into. 15 minutes later, the first one rolled up. Deacon, tall, broad-shouldered, and still in full sheriff uniform after his morning shift. He got out of his cruiser, casually walked up the driveway, and gave me a bear hug before glancing over at Karen, who looked like she just swallowed a lemon. "Everything all right, brother?" he asked. "Just dealing with an HOA transition board," I said, adding finger quotes. Deacon raised an eyebrow at Karen. "Man, you got business here?" "I do," she said proudly. "I'm acting on behalf of the HOA. He's violating porch codes." Deacon slowly took off his sunglasses. "There's no HOA here. This street never had one, and if you keep issuing fake compliance notices, you're going to end up in real legal trouble." Karen went pale, but it wasn't over. Not by a long shot. 2 more trucks pulled up. Another uniform, then another. Before long, my quiet front yard looked like the pregame of a Marine Corps reunion. And Karen? Karen stood frozen in place, clutching her clipboard like a teddy bear during a thunderstorm. She had come to evict me from my porch, but my entire unit was about to show her exactly who she was messing with. By the time the morning haze lifted and sunlight poured across the yard, my porch had become the most unintentionally fortified front step in the entire county. Deacon was still there, leaned casually against the railing, sipping coffee with his badge clipped neatly on his belt. My dog Rusty had found a sunny spot and was snoring like a chainsaw and idle. You'd think that would be enough to make Karen reconsider, maybe apologize, maybe just quietly back away and move on with her life. But no, Karen wasn't the kind of woman who retreats. She was the kind who doubles down. And boy, did she double down. Around noon, I stepped out to retrieve my mail and found the neighborhood littered with poorly printed flyers taped to lampposts, trash cans, and even some cars. All of them had the same ridiculous header in bold red letters. Emergency HOA meeting, community violation at lot 17. Beneath that was a grainy photo of me on my porch, coffee in hand, dog asleep beside me, with the caption, "Unauthorized occupation of community entryway." I almost spit out my gum laughing. Karen had turned my peaceful Saturday morning into a full-blown smear campaign. I gathered up a few of the flyers and brought them back to the porch. Deacon skimmed one and shook his head. "This lady's trying to go full dictator with a printer and zero actual authority." The funniest part wasn't even the content. It was the fact that the photo looked like it had been taken with a flip phone from 2007. You could barely make out my face. It looked like I was being accused of loitering in a grainy crime reenactment video. Karen must have stayed up all night creating these. Things got even more bizarre when her so-called certified compliance officer arrived. It was the same guy she'd called on the phone yesterday, Greg. He showed up in a beat-up sedan that still had a for sale sign in the window. He stepped out wearing a reflective vest, khaki cargo pants, and a ball cap that read "Security" in peely letters. He carried a clipboard and walked with the exaggerated confidence of a man who'd just been given fake power. He didn't even glance at me as he strutted toward the porch. He cleared his throat like he was about to deliver a sermon. "Sir," he began, adjusting the cheap sunglasses on his nose, "you've been officially flagged for non-compliance with the Homeowners Association's Civic Guidelines, Section 3.2, regarding porch occupation and visual uniformity." I blinked. "Did you just say visual uniformity?" He nodded seriously. "Yes, sir. This porch doesn't comply with community harmony aesthetics." Deacon let out a wheezing laugh and nearly spilled his coffee. "I'm sorry. Did you just insult a Marine's porch design?" he said, walking forward with slow, deliberate steps. "Let me see some ID." Greg hesitated, then pulled a laminated card from his vest. It was a gym membership with his name scribbled in marker on the back. Deacon stared at it for a moment, then looked back at me. "He's serious." "I'm not leaving," I said calmly, "and unless you're about to issue me a violation from the Department of Make-Believe, I suggest you take your clipboard and head back to that lemon of a car before I call the real authorities." Greg stood there for another beat, looking at Karen across the street, who was filming everything on her phone. Then he mumbled something about documenting the incident and retreated to his vehicle, which stalled twice before he got it to drive off. About 30 minutes later, things took another sharp turn. Karen called the actual police, not that AutoZone rejects this time. Real law enforcement. 2 cruisers pulled up with lights flashing, and she ran to them like a child meeting Santa Claus at the mall. She was waving her phone, still recording, and yelling over and over that a group of unauthorized males in military attire had unlawfully occupied public space. The officers approached cautiously but professionally. One of them asked for an explanation. I stepped off the porch, greeted them with a handshake, and explained the situation clearly. Deacon handed over his sheriff's ID, and then, like fate had scripted the perfect twist, the second officer tilted his head and smiled wide. "Corporal Nash," he said. I looked closer. Wes. It was Wesley, another Marine from my unit. I hadn't seen him since the deployment, but the moment I heard his voice, I remembered everything. We shook hands, then embraced like brothers do when time disappears. The officers huddled for a moment, speaking quietly, then walked back toward Karen. I couldn't hear everything, but I saw the change in her face as they explained the reality of her situation. Her mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air, the moment she realized that not only was I not some porch squatter, but that I had more legal ground to stand on than she ever would. It was delicious. She didn't retreat, though. Oh no. She stormed away down the street, muttering something about going above local jurisdiction. As the officers drove off, Wesley gave me a knowing look and said, "You sure know how to pick a neighborhood." I laughed. It picked me, but something Wesley said stuck. That night, I started digging. I looked up property records, zoning maps, and city council minutes, and something interesting came up. The so-called HOA Karen was referencing, it didn't exist legally, but there was a petition filed 2 months ago. An unofficial application to start a new HOA with Karen listed as the acting president. It had been denied, flat out rejected by the county. That explained her desperation. She wasn't part of a real HOA. She was trying to invent one, take control, and start enforcing her personal rules on the neighborhood by brute force. Even crazier, the records showed she didn't even own the house she was living in. She was a tenant, and not a particularly good one either. 3 noise complaints, 1 dispute about digging without a permit, and an old civil suit for unpermitted community beautification. I sat back in my chair, phone still in hand, porch light buzzing softly above me. This wasn't about rules. This wasn't about porch colors or loitering. This was about power. Karen wanted to control people, and the only way she thought she could do that was by pretending she already did. And now she dragged in a whole squad of Marines. I smiled to myself. She had no clue what was coming next. The next morning, I woke up to the sound of hammering. Not from my house, not even from a neighbor doing construction. It was Karen. She was nailing wooden posts into the ground near the sidewalk, right on the edge of my property line. Curious, I stepped outside and watched from my porch with a cup of fresh coffee in hand. Rusty followed me, yawning and stretching as if he already knew the day would be filled with nonsense. Karen was dressed like she was about to appear on a reality TV show about delusional neighborhood leaders. Bright purple visor, clipboard slung over her arm, and a T-shirt that said President, Founding HOA Committee. She had installed 3 wooden stakes, tied them together with red tape, and posted a laminated paper on the middle one. From a distance, I could already tell it was another one of her homemade flyers. As I approached, she held up her hand like a traffic cop. "This is a restricted zone now," she announced. "You're not allowed to interfere with official HOA boundary marking." I blinked, genuinely speechless for a second. Boundary marking. She tapped the laminated paper. The community has decided to implement territorial zoning for shared use porch regions and pedestrian welcome areas. This porch has been marked as a conflict zone and is currently under review for public reassignment. I stared at her, then at the sad little triangle of tape tied between the stakes like a kindergarten science fair project. It took every ounce of strength not to burst into laughter. "Karen," I said calmly, "you do realize that you are building imaginary borders on property that doesn't belong to you." She smirked. "As acting president of the pending HOA, I have the authority to make preliminary designations. This area will soon be integrated. You can't integrate what you don't own, I said, but she just waved me off and marched back to her house with her clipboard like a queen returning to her castle after declaring a siege. That was the final straw. I pulled out my phone and messaged the group chat again. Operation Porch Shield is a go. Assemble. Within the hour, 3 more members of my old Marine unit rolled up, one by one. First came Travis, who now worked as a federal investigator. He brought donuts, because of course he did. Then Morgan, a cybersecurity specialist who spent 10 years detecting fraud, arrived with a drone camera and a tripod. Finally, Sawyer, our former squad medic turned MP, showed up wearing his uniform and carrying a folding lawn chair. He set it up on the porch beside me and sat like we were at a tailgate party. Karen reemerged from her house, stunned to see the porch had now transformed into a Marine reunion zone. 4 men in varying uniforms and badges, calmly drinking coffee and talking like it was a Sunday afternoon at a VFW picnic. Morgan's drone took off and buzzed quietly over the neighborhood, capturing aerial footage of Karen's stakes and her makeshift conflict zone. She came storming across the street again, fuming. "You can't gather like this without HOA clearance," she shouted. "You're making the neighbors feel unsafe." "Which neighbors?" I asked. "The ones who waved and brought us muffins, or the ones laughing at your flyers on the community Facebook page?" Karen's face turned crimson. "You're staging a military intimidation tactic. This is coercion." Travis stood up and calmly pulled out a folder. "You've been issuing fraudulent notices, trespassing, impersonating an authority figure, and attempting to enforce laws that don't exist. Want me to show you what a real federal violation looks like?" Karen stumbled backward, clearly shaken. "This isn't over," she muttered. "You'll be hearing from my legal advisor." "Oh," said Sawyer, standing up. "Tell him to stop by. We'll be here all day." Karen stormed off again, this time visibly rattled. We all shared a laugh, then went back to drinking coffee and catching up. But this wasn't just a show of force. It was a reminder that when people try to bully others with lies and fake authority, there's always a point where the truth comes roaring in. And this time, it came in with uniforms, credentials, and calm defiance. Later that afternoon, Karen returned with a new plan. This time, she brought Greg again, the so-called compliance officer, along with a new partner, some guy in khakis and a golf shirt who looked like he'd been dragged out of a barbecue. Greg once again wore his reflective vest and carried his infamous clipboard. The new guy had a camera and started filming from across the street. "This is an official recording of a neighborhood violation," Greg announced. "These men are unlawfully occupying a disputed area and are now subject to a porch shutdown order." I stood up slowly, walked to the edge of my property, and held up my phone. "Do you really want to go on camera again, Greg? Because last time didn't end well for you." Then I turned the camera on him. Greg hesitated. His partner lowered the camera. Travis stood beside me and calmly pulled out a printed cease and desist letter, already prepared based on Karen's flyers and previous impersonation. "By recording and threatening enforcement action under a non-existent authority," Travis said, "you're violating state impersonation laws and entering harassment territory. This letter outlines the legal consequences. If you don't leave now, we'll call the sheriff again." Greg turned to Karen, who had stayed a few feet back. "You said this was legit," he muttered. Karen shouted, "Stand your ground. This is about order." But Greg and his friend didn't want any part of it anymore. They turned around, muttering apologies, and left. Karen stood alone, flustered, yelling at no one in particular. For the first time, she looked like she knew the hill she was defending wasn't just crumbling. It had never existed in the first place. The final laugh came not from us, but from fate. As Karen turned to head home, she realized her car, parked half on my lawn and half in front of a clearly marked fire hydrant, was being hooked up by a real city tow truck. One of the neighbors, a retired firefighter, had called it in. We watched as the tow truck driver shrugged at Karen's protest and flipped on the winch. The car was hoisted up and rolled away down the street as she screamed after it. "This is harassment. This is illegal," she cried. The tow truck driver didn't even respond. just drove away slowly as Karen stood there like someone who just lost the final piece of her imaginary empire. The silence afterward was thick with poetic justice. As the sun dipped low in the sky and the last of the day's tension faded, I looked around at my brothers, my porch, and the peaceful stretch of land I called home. Karen had tried to claim it, control it, twist it into something she could rule, but instead, she built herself a stage for public humiliation, and the curtain had just dropped. The neighborhood felt different after the incident with the tow truck. People who had been quietly observing from behind curtains were now waving when they walked past. Some stopping by just to say they appreciated what we were doing. One older couple even brought over a peach cobbler with a note that read, "Thank you for defending the porch." It was funny how something as simple as sitting on a porch had become a line in the sand. For Karen, it had been a battle of control. For the rest of us, it was a reminder of what happens when you try to push good people around with fake power and a cheap clipboard. But Karen wasn't done yet. I knew it the second I saw a white envelope tucked into my mailbox the next morning. It was stamped with big, bold letters. Legal notice. Inside was a print out of a complaint Karen had filed with the local small claims court. She was suing me for emotional distress, disruption of community peace, and what she described as unauthorized military presence meant to incite fear and suppress HOA activities. The part that really made me laugh was her asking for $15,000 in damages and mandatory porch relocation. It was like she thought my steps could be airlifted to a more compliant household. I forwarded the letter to Travis and to our unit's former JAU lawyer, Leo, who had just gotten back from a conference in D.C. and was more than happy to take a look. He called me within the hour, already chuckling. "She wrote this up herself," he said. "There's no legal standing, and every single complaint she's filed contradicts public property records. Her whole claim is based on a fantasy HOA that doesn't exist." Still, Leo insisted we respond officially, just to make things airtight. He drafted a counterclaim backed with evidence, copies of my deed, photos of her trespassing, documentation of the impersonation, and statements from multiple neighbors. He even pulled in the footage from Morgan's drone showing Karen planting her ridiculous tape posts across my lawn. The icing on the cake was a screenshot from a community Facebook group where Karen admitted in a comment that the HOA was still in early planning stages. Leo printed that out, highlighted it, and clipped it to the top of the file. We sent everything over, and within 3 days, the court rejected her complaint. No hearing, no chance to appeal. Karen had filed under her full name, and the judge's note on the ruling was clear. No evidence of a legal homeowners association or actionable violation of rights. Respondent owns the property in question. I expected Karen to retreat after that. Most people would, but she came back louder. This time she wasn't alone. She had tried to rally a few neighbors to her side. 3 households, all recent transplants who hadn't figured out Karen's game yet. They stood on the sidewalk with handmade signs that read things like "End porch occupation" and "Protect our HOA vision." It looked less like a protest and more like an awkward picnic where nobody brought snacks. One of the signs was written in glitter pen. Another spelled "neighborhood" wrong. I sat on the porch with Travis and Leo, watching the small group try to chant. They weren't particularly loud. A few passing cars honked, but it was unclear if they were supporting the protest or mocking it. Probably the latter. Leo raised an eyebrow and said, "Do they realize this isn't a real HOA?" I shook my head. I think they're just afraid to tell her no. But her illusions started falling apart fast. The next day, a real HOA board from a neighboring subdivision reached out to Karen through a cease and desist letter. She had been using their logo and referring to her movement by the same name, even claiming she was in talks to merge communities. The board wasn't amused. The letter was worded professionally but carried the weight of real legal firepower. They demanded that she immediately stop using their branding, remove all flyers with their name, and publicly clarify that no such merger existed. They gave her 48 hours. Karen posted a long, frantic apology video online, trying to spin it as an unfortunate misunderstanding caused by shared goals. But the damage was done. The 3 families who'd supported her protest quietly stepped away, one even sending a message to our porch group chat saying they'd been missiled and didn't want to be part of any further drama. Karen was losing control of the narrative, and fast. To celebrate, the guys and I decided to do something symbolic. We took a trip to the local hardware store and picked up a flagpole, a sturdy one made of steel with a locking base. We installed it right in the center of the yard, surrounded by fresh mulch and a ring of small solar lights. When it was done, we raised 2 flags, the United States flag and beneath it, the Marine Corps flag. As we stepped back to admire it, neighbors gathered around, clapping, smiling, taking pictures. One elderly man who'd served in Vietnam wiped his eyes and said, "That's the best thing I've seen on this street in 20 years. Karen, of course, was watching from across the street. She had her arms folded, her mouth tight, and the ever-present clipboard still clutched in her hand like it held the secrets of the universe. But she said nothing. She didn't march over. She didn't yell. For the first time since this all began, she was still. A few days later, I heard some interesting news from a mutual contact, Karen's landlord. He had seen everything online, the videos, the protest, the legal mess. He had no idea she was pretending to run an HOA or dragging his property into drama. Apparently, he'd received several inquiries from actual HOA boards asking why his tenant was impersonating their leadership. That was enough. He gave her formal notice of lease termination for violating her rental agreement by creating community conflict and exposing the property to legal risk. The last time I saw her, she was loading boxes into a moving truck. She didn't look angry anymore, just tired, worn out from fighting a battle that never had a chance. I didn't gloat. I didn't say a word. I just sat on my porch like I always had, Rusty beside me, coffee in hand, watching the world return to peace. By sunset, the truck was gone, and the house across the street was quiet. No more flyers, no more tape, just the sound of crickets and the soft rustle of flags in the breeze. The false queen of a make-believe kingdom had finally abdicated, and all it took was truth, unity, and a porch full of Marines who weren't about to let a bully win. The neighborhood settled into something like normal after Karen's departure. But it wasn't the same kind of normal that existed before her arrival. It was quieter, yes, but there was also something stronger about the street now. Something more connected. The neighbors who had once kept to themselves now lingered on walks, stopping to chat, share updates, or simply say hello. People waved more. They smiled more. It was as if everyone had exhaled the tension that had built up during Karen's absurd reign. And now, for the first time in a long time, they could breathe easy again. My porch became a place of gathering without even trying. I'd come out with my morning coffee, and someone would already be waving from across the street. Some days, Deacon would swing by after a shift with breakfast sandwiches and stories. Morgan dropped off a USB with edited drone footage stitched together with local news clippings and neighborhood posts. He called it Operation Porch Shield, the full timeline. We watched it one night under the stars on a projector screen someone had brought over, and the whole block showed up with lawn chairs and snacks. People laughed, pointed at the moment Karen's car got towed, and cheered when the flag went up. No one said it, but everyone felt it. Something powerful had happened here. We'd reminded each other what community meant. A few weeks passed, and just when I thought things had settled permanently, I received an unannounced visit from an older gentleman in a dark blue car. He pulled up slowly, stepped out in a crisp blazer, and approached with calm purpose. I stood from my seat on the porch, watching curiously. Rusty, sensing the man wasn't a threat, stayed curled up, half asleep. The man introduced himself as Colonel Bennett, retired from the United States Marine Corps. He'd heard about the neighborhood showdown from a mutual contact, one of the officers in my old unit who now worked in D.C., and he'd made the drive just to shake my hand. We sat together for a while, talking shop, laughing about boot camp memories, and shaking our heads at how entitlement seemed to grow louder the further it was from actual authority. Before he left, he reached into his pocket and pressed a challenge coin into my palm. It was one of those thick, heavy ones, the kind with real weight, both literal and symbolic. He looked me in the eyes and said, "You reminded people what silent strength looks like. That matters." I didn't expect that kind of moment to move me the way it did, but it stuck with me. That coin didn't just represent military service. It symbolized the fight we'd won, with calm, with reason, with restraint, and with brotherhood. We didn't raise voices. We didn't escalate. We stood together and didn't flinch. Soon after, I decided it was time to finish something I'd put off since the first run-in with Karen. I ordered the supplies and started building a proper fence around my property. Not one of those chain-link barriers, but a solid, clean wooden fence lined with motion sensors and a fresh coat of paint. When it was finished, I posted one clear sign right at the entrance gate. It was carved in bold black letters on stained cedar. Private property. Trespassers will be removed by the owner or his unit. Some folks chuckled when they saw it, but no one misunderstood it. It wasn't about intimidation. It was a boundary, and one that would never again be crossed by someone looking to play queen on stolen land. As summer deepened, the yard became more than just a place for me. Families brought their kids to play in the open space. Neighbors brought folding chairs and coolers, using my porch as the unofficial meeting spot. We had cookouts, fire pit nights, and even a 4th of July celebration that brought out half the town. Nobody mentioned Karen anymore, but her absence was a kind of presence itself. Everyone was more at ease, more themselves. And without anyone asking or organizing, they started calling my place something that made me laugh the first time I heard it. Freedom Watch. Hey, we'll meet over at Freedom Watch tonight. You bringing chairs to Freedom Watch? Even local delivery drivers caught on. One guy left a pizza with a note that read, "Respect to the Porch Patrol." But it wasn't about ego. None of it was. It was just a porch, just a house. What had made it special was the stand we took, quietly, firmly, and without backing down. It wasn't about revenge or rubbing her nose in it. We never needed to stoop to her level. That's what made the difference. We simply stood our ground until the storm passed. I thought often about what might have happened if we hadn't pushed back. If Karen had managed to convince just a few more people. If she'd gone unchecked. If fear had won instead of unity. It reminded me that it doesn't take a whole army to stop a bully. Just a handful of people who refuse to be bullied. One evening, as the sun was dropping low and the sky was painted orange and gold, I found myself back on that porch alone, this time sipping the same coffee I'd had the morning this all began. Rusty lay at my feet, old and content, watching the trees sway. The flags flapped gently above. The porch light clicked on with the dusk. It was peaceful, strong home. There was no drama anymore, no shouting, no flyers, no imaginary laws being stuffed into mailboxes, just quiet strength and the occasional laugh from down the street. Every now and then, a new neighbor would move in and ask about the flagpole or the sign at the gate, and someone would always tell the story. It had become neighborhood lore. The time a woman tried to take a porch and instead built a legend. The time Marines returned not with weapons, but with chairs and coffee and calm resolve. As I sat there, watching the day slip into night, I felt something deep at my chest. Not pride exactly, but something more grounded. Gratitude for my brothers, for the people around me, for the simple power of truth, and for that stubborn little porch that stood through it all. So I leaned back in my chair, stretched out my legs, and let the quiet wrap around me like a well-worn blanket. And with the last rays of sunlight glinting off the Marine Corps emblem and the flag above me, I raised my cup and whispered to no one in particular. Some folks really do learn the hard way. Then I took a slow sip and smiled.